Bridget here?
Yeah.
Are you ready? Are we ready to go, or do you want to?
Yes, yes. Please introduce our lovely guest.
All right. Okay, so Jaden Terrell is a Seamus Award finalist and the internationally published author of the Nashville-based Jared McKean private detective series. At the other end of the spectrum is Trouble Most Fair, a cozy black cat detective romantic mystery set at a Renaissance fair. Jaden's short stories have appeared in numerous anthologies. She's a contributor to the international thriller Writers Big Thrill magazine, and she's a recipient of the Killer Nashville Builder Award, as well as the Magnolia Award and the Silver Quill Award for service to the Southeast Mystery Writers of America. Jaden lives in Nashville with her husband and 3 dogs, and she's going to be with us for the next 2 hours, helping us overcome the challenges, obstacles, and missteps on our road to success while she presents her workshop, Story Weaving and Takeaways, which is designed to teach us how to stay the course, hone the craft, and build our writer's life. So now I'm excited to turn the program over to Jaden. But first, I want to say that when we were emailing just a few days ago, she told me she would try to be interesting. But I've been talking to her for a little while, and I'm sure that she's not going to have to try very hard. So I'm turning it over to you, Jaden.
Thank you. Just as a FYI, server quality is kind of low sometimes around here, so if I drop out, I will come back, and we will call that an unscheduled break. And there may at some point be a puppy climb up here. I will try to wrangle him out of our way as soon as possible. I have a PowerPoint, and I want to go back and forth. One thing, so you don't have to just see this talking head for 2 hours, but also so that there are some things you'll want to see. That I have a handout, but we wanted to give it to you after this so that you could hear it in context. And also because if you're anything like I am, you would have read it all ahead of time, and then you would be really doubly bored right now. So I'm going to go back and forth a little bit. And if you have questions, put them in the chat or pop in if it's related to what we're saying. If something occurs to you and it's not related to what I'm saying, if you jot it down so you can ask during the Q&A, there will be plenty of time, I hope, for you guys to ask questions. So when we were starting this, Bridget asked me to talk a little bit about my story and how I got started and what are some of the challenges of being an author, and how do you get yourself to sit in the chair and do it. And I am in a pretty good position to talk about overcoming things, because if there's a mistake that could have been made as an author, I've probably made it. I had a client, a friend, who said at one time, we're friends on Facebook, and she said she could never write again because she had had a really bad publishing experience and she had made terrible mistake, and she would never ever be able to overcome it. And I was like, I don't think there's anything you can't overcome. And she just kind of was stuck there. And I finally said, we got to get on the phone. And when we finished talking, she's like, oh, maybe I can get over that. So there are those of us who are secretariat, like a friend of mine who said she had told her agent she wanted to launch out like a racehorse and make it all the way to the top. And she really did do that. She was a secretariat. But others are Hidalgo. And that's okay too. The important thing to remember is that Hidalgo won his race as well. And the only way to win, though, is to persevere. You have to stay the course. If you give up, obviously, you're not going to win. You won't get that dream. But it's a brutal career in some ways. It's beautiful, and it has so many rewards, and you get to hang out with great authors like this. But there's also a lot of setbacks, and so you really have to be willing and able to go, okay, that didn't work, move ahead. So I'm going to tell you my story a little bit first, because that's one of the things I was asked to do. But it will also illustrate to you that all the places where things can go right and all the places things can go wrong, and that ability to pivot if you need to, and just keep going, because you never know what might seem like a setback at some point might actually lead you to something good along the way. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it in this viewpoint, if that's okay with you, because it'll make it easier for me to go back and forth, I think. Well, let me try to slideshow and see how that works. We'll just go from there. So the journey that I took, we said, when did you know you wanted to be a writer? And the answer to that is when I was really old enough to know there was such a thing as a writer, that's when I wanted to be one. And when I was really small, before I could write or read, and I started reading really young because I was staying with two great aunts who, those were our games. We learned to read and write. Well, I would make these pages and pages of tall loops and small loops because that's what cursive writing looked like to me. And I thought I was writing these long epic stories, but of course nobody could read them except me. And so I knew that I wanted to be a writer, and I also knew I wanted to be a teacher. So from the time I was about 8, I was like, I want to be a writer and I want to be a teacher. And then when I was 12, I kind of narrowed that down. I knew I wanted to be a special ed teacher. And I was. And I love those kids. Man, they were terrific kids. And I still hear from some of them sometimes. But it's a very emotionally demanding job. And it also takes a lot of your verbal skills. You just pour everything you have into those kids. And so I didn't have a lot of time. I thought I would be able to be a writer and a teacher at the same time, but I could not and give my kids what I felt like they deserved and needed from me. So every year I think, well, 2 years I'm going to quit and I'm going to write for a while. And every time there would be some kid that I couldn't bear to leave, or a group of kids. I can't leave Derek. I can't leave Paul. I can't leave Amy. And finally, our system restructured, so I wasn't going to get any of the same kids. And I took some time off to write. It's like, now I'm going to take a sabbatical. I even took my retirement so I could afford to do that. And I'm going to learn this writing thing. Well, I did. I started with epic fantasy, and I finished one, and that was really good. It was a really good experience for me. It was the first of a big trilogy, but I wasn't getting a lot of interest from agents about it. Apparently, that's a pretty hard field to break into, and I hadn't finished the entire trilogy, and I was a complete unknown. And it was not, in retrospect, I read it again, I still really like it, but it was still, the writing was still kind of amateurish, and I had not grown enough as a writer to really stand out in the field. And so I read a book. It was called Money for Writers. And I thought, I need that, because I was coming to the end of that retirement. And it was, have you guys heard of the St. Martin's Press? I'm going to have to go out of this. The St. Martin's contest for PI novels and cozy novels. Well, that was what I entered. And they sent me the guidelines 6 weeks beforehand. And I said, I'm going to do it anyway, because if it's bad, then I will, if it's bad, then I'm going to say, well, what did you expect? I wrote it in 6 weeks. I think I'm not sharing my screen with you yet, though. I'm going to say, yeah, what did you expect? I wrote it in 6 weeks. And so I did. I got a really nice note back from the judge, and that was enough to make me think, okay, maybe I have what it takes to do this. And so, but it wasn't that good because it was only 6 weeks, so I didn't have time to edit it. She sent me a really nice note, and I was encouraged. So the setback was, A, I wasn't getting any bites on my fantasy, and B, this thing wasn't ready to go yet. So I took it back and I revised it and I revised it and revised it, and I did all the things you were supposed to do. I got beta readers. I got all this other feedback from people, and I got an agent almost immediately, which was really exciting. And I'm like, I'm on my way. I'm going to be there. Yay. And he couldn't sell it. And he couldn't sell it. And he couldn't sell it. And we got all those, those good rejections that you hear about. Well, he said, I never get that. I don't understand why this is happening. Because I always get, we love this, we want it. Or I get, oh, it's not for us. I never get, we love it, we don't want it. And I said, well, there's something wrong with it. That's the problem. But we didn't know what it was. Because they kept saying, we love these characters. We love this writing. We love. And so I did an exercise that I'm going to tell you about a little bit later when I get into the revision part. And I rewrote it completely. And then a friend of mine said, I want to publish this for you. And I thought he had a little publishing house. Here's a lesson. Always do your research. Don't make assumptions. Because what he really meant was he was going to submit it to iUniverse for me, and he was going to self-publish it for me. Now, that was really kind. And he was putting out, shelling out some money to do that for me. And I did not have the heart to tell him no. I went and talked to my agent. He said, well, we're not having any luck with it. So maybe you should try it. So we did. And while we were trying it, he said, I've kind of lost the train of my story a little bit, but we had also submitted it to Warner and Random House and all those, and Warner said, we really like this book, but it doesn't have enough twists and turns in it. And I said, I can fix that. And he said that we don't want you to fix it. They want you to write a new one. Okay, so I wrote a new one, and they liked it and went all the way up almost to the top. And then they said, oh, we don't want to take this because we have another one that also has a similar theme, and we don't want to compete with ourselves, so we're not going to take it after all. So you get these highs, and then you get these lows. So I said, okay, I did have the second book, and I went back and read the first one, and that's when I realized how to rewrite it again and to make it better. And that's when my friend decided he would self-publish it for me. So we did do that, and it was this book that came out as Too Close to Evil. And you can see, let's see if I can do this. You can see that Too Close to Evil has a very thrillery look to it. It's not a very professional looking cover, but you can tell it's a thriller. It doesn't look cozy at all, right? But this name, Elizabeth Terrell, at the bottom, people made an assumption about. And the problem is not that Elizabeth is a woman. The problem is that Elizabeth brings an image to people's minds, and it's something feminine. They think that an Elizabeth is going to write a cozy or a romance or a romantic suspense. They do not think that an Elizabeth is going to write a hard-boiled PI novel, which is what this is. And so I had all kind of bookstore owners who would say, Beth, I've been trying to get people to read this book because I know it's the kind of book they want, and they won't even take it because they'll say, look, I don't read that kind of books. I don't read cozies. And they go, this is exactly the kind of book you like. And they would go, no, no, no. But the people who did want it, even though it had this crazy thriller, like big honking gun on the front, they would pick it up and want it, and they'd start to read it and they would, oh no, that's not what I want at all. So I was completely missing my audience. So the bad thing was that this was in the days before self-publishing was so common, and it wasn't very well looked upon, and there's a stigma, and I didn't know enough about marketing. And so I couldn't do much with that book. But the good thing was I got that feedback. So I knew when it was picked up later by a traditional publisher, I knew that I needed a pen name that was unisex, which is why I'm Jaden instead of Beth. Because it's like when you combine this face with the name like Elizabeth, there's too much of an image that's warring with what the book is. It's like I'm the anti-advertisement for the books that I was writing. So that was the good thing. And the other good thing was that I started to make a lot of connections with people, other authors who treated me just like one of them. And I went to conferences and I was networking, and I'm really introverted, but I also really like people. So it gave me an in with writers I might never have. So I had some opportunities that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't done that. So was it a mistake? I don't know. I'll never know. But I'm nonetheless glad I did it because it gave me some opportunities down the road. So that book then was picked up by a little bitty micro press, and there were like 3 iterations of it before I finally got my new agent. And I finally got a contract, and I got a contract based on the second book, because this one we thought, you know how you always hear if you've self-published a book, you can't publish traditionally, or you can't publish in that series. And it is hard, it's very hard, but we had one of the major six was interested in taking the series anyway, the second book, but they wanted me to change my male character into a woman because the strong female character is what's selling. And I talked to my agent, and she said, because I said, well, I'm too close to this. I feel like he's not a woman, and it changes everything she asked, that she said she loved. She said, just change the pronouns. I'm like, you can't just change the pronouns. Everything changes. But I said, okay, I'm willing to think about this because I want it to be a better book. Do you think it would be a better book if I did that? And my agent said, no, because all the things I like best, you'd have to change too. So we decided that we would not go with the big house, and I was not going to make that change. Was that a mistake? I don't think it was, but some people would say that it was, that you would need to take that chance no matter what. But I knew it would make that book a worse book, and so I wasn't willing to do it. So what we did was she sold, again, the second book to the publisher that I have now, the Permanent Press, and I told him about that first book, and he said, can I see it? Can you get the rights back? And I said, I can get the rights back. And he loved it, so they actually ended up taking the whole series, and there are 4 of them now, and this one is first. So it was a very convoluted way of getting there with a lot of mistakes along the way. And at any point, I could have said, I'm going to give up on this book because it's not going anywhere, or I'm going to give up on this writing thing because I'm obviously not very good at it. But I wasn't willing to do that because I loved the book, I loved the series, I loved the character, and because I knew in my heart I was supposed to be a writer. And so that's where we ended up. And you jump in if you have questions. But so it was a pretty long journey. And this book, this Racing the Devil book, in its new iteration, was the one that was shortlisted for a Seamus Award. And that was that was so exciting because it was a real validation that even though it was with a small press, and even though it had this journey, this kind of bumpy road, that this book was good and that people would enjoy it. And that it gave me, I guess maybe for the first time, I felt like a real author. I knew I was a writer before, but I felt now, even though I'd had a book before, I was kind of always knew it wasn't as good as it could be, but I didn't know how to make it better. But finally here I reached the point where, yeah, I had that validation. Other people like it. It must be good. So if you have that little voice that's telling you I'm not good enough, you just got to keep going and keep trying to get better, because this book and this book, even though they're the same story, they're not at all the same book. It's so much better now, and I grew so much as a writer. And while I'm not sorry that I did this because it opened some doors to me, it was published too soon. And I knew in my heart it was too soon, but I kind of bowed to some friends who were saying, it's ready, you know, it's ready, you know, it's good. And but I always kind of knew it was, I always kind of cringe when somebody picks it up on Amazon because I know that that's not the way the story is supposed to be. So it was a long, long journey. And from here to here, from this fantasy novel to this final Racing the Devil, was probably a decade. They go faster than that now, but probably a decade. Now we have 4 books in the Jared series, and then we have the Cozy Cat Detective book, which is an opportunity that came up because of this journey that I went on. I'm gonna talk about some challenges next, but first I'm gonna pop out of this and see if there's questions in the chat, or if you have any questions you want to ask me about. Anybody got anything? Nope. Okay, we're gonna go back.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
I did.
Good.
Can you
Janet.
just give a little hint of what substantively changed from the first iteration of the book to the Racing the Devil? I've read
Yes.
Racing the Devil. It's a really engaging characters. The plot's good, although he certainly is foolish about women. But I'm just
That's his Achilles heel.
yeah. But I just really like to maybe just a little hint without maybe giving away the plot, because I encourage everybody to read it because it's just a really well done story with a good character.
Thank you. I'm going to go into that in a fair amount of detail when we get into the craft section and the revision section. But I'll give you a hint right now, which is that basically it had no plot. It had a very, very thin mystery plot. It was kind of like a coat hanger that I hung the character on. And it was essentially a really good, like 300-page character study. And the character was, as you were talking about, the character was engaging enough that it sort of obscured the problems for both the agent and apparently the people who were rejecting it were saying, okay, we really love this, but it's not for us, or it's not this. And as soon as I finished the second book, and when I went back and read the first one, I knew exactly what was wrong with it. It really didn't have a plot. And so I had to, but I wasn't willing to give up on it because I loved the book so much. I loved the character so much. And so I had to shore up, I had to spend that time distilling the character stuff so that I still had all the things they loved, but I had to really shore up the plot. Huge. And so I'll give you the exact details about how I did it before, but what I ended up doing was essentially every day I would take stuff out and I would put new stuff in. I'd take out, or I'd distill character stuff and I'd put in more plot stuff. And at the end of every day, it was exactly the same length as it was when I started. But when I got to the end, it was the better balance that you're seeing now. So I had gone through beta readers and critique groups and everything else, and they're like, oh, we love it, we love it, we love it. But I could tell there was something wrong. And that was my other takeaway from this, which is if you are writing in a genre that's selling and you're not getting any takers, there's probably a problem with the book that you can probably make it better. A lot of people will jump to self-publishing then, as I did, kind of against my better judgment. But, and I'm not saying those people can't make sales, but I'm saying that if you're regularly getting that from publishers and they're not saying this is a perfect book, but it's a niche book, or this is this is a wonderful book, I think the market is too small. If you're getting just like, we love this, but it's not for us, there's probably a problem with the book, if you know it's a commercial kind of book. Anything else before we hop back into the slides? Okay. Challenges of being a writer. Time management is huge. If you're James Patterson and you write one of every 19 or 17 books written in the United States and you're making millions and millions of dollars, you have different time management concerns than you do if you're more of a small press author and you have to do other things to make a living. But either way, you're having to manage your time, and you're having to manage it between, like in my case, I do a lot of editing and workshops and things like that. And I love to teach, so that's good, but it does take away from writing time. When you're going to conferences, when you're doing book marketing, you got to fit that into your time. And it's also really important to remember to save writing time because it's easy to make that the last thing you do when it really should be the first thing you do. There's a wonderful author named Philip Schafari. He's a New York author. He's with a small press, literary author, and he teaches writing. And he gave me one of the best quotes I've ever heard about it. And he said, "Be ruthless with your writing time. Protect it with your life." And I have written that. I've got it on my phone. I've written on index cards. I've got it posted everywhere because I have a tendency to overcommit and do kind of too much. And I might have a writer friend who's struggling and hop on the phone with them, and those to kind of brainstorm them through it. And those things really chip away at your writing time and your writing energy. So you want to make sure that you do protect that part of it. Another issue, book marketing, is some people are really natural at it and some people are not. And a lot of authors tend to be introverts, and a lot of us tend to have been taught from the time we're very young that you should never brag on yourself. You should never push yourself forward. Other people are more important. You should always put others ahead of yourself, that kind of thing, which gives you kind of a warring motivation. You have two conflicting motivations. And something else I think stops us sometimes is that the thing we think we want and the thing we really want are also sometimes at odds. Like I might say, man, I want James Patterson's readership. I want to sell millions of books and be, be like the world star, playing that big super bestseller sandbox. But if I think about what that life entails, and I think, well, then I got to travel, I got to meet all these people, I got to spend so much time away from home, I've got to do this. And if the things that it would take to get that are things that secretly I find intimidating, or that they're outside my comfort zone, or that where I think, if I actually think about that lifestyle it is, if I think that is too daunting or even unattractive, then I'm not gonna, my subconscious is gonna stop me from doing it. I have a friend and client who asked me one day, Beth, do you think I should try to get an agent and a bigger publisher? He's with a small press. He has a really nice following where he lives. He's got his books in all these little shops. He's in a tourist area and people pick up his books as mementos. He makes a nice living from them. And I said, well, do you want to? And he said, I don't think I do. She said, I really like what I'm doing right now. I make enough to live on. I'm comfortable. I can go to Paris once every year, a couple of times a year even. And I have readers who email me and tell me they like the book, and getting an agent and going with a bigger house just seems like a real pain to me. And I said, well, that's your answer right there. So figuring out what it is you really want and making sure that's in alignment with what your goal is going to be really helpful for you, knowing what you want to do. And if you know that they're at war with each other, you can ask yourself, do I then want to expand my comfort zone so that I can go for that superstar level? Or does the idea of being a sort of mid-list author and making a nice comfortable living, or even a nice hobby living, is that what I will be most comfortable and happy with? And then that's what you pursue. So this whole book marketing thing, figuring out how much of it you want to do, how much of it is necessary to get the life you want, and then making those align, either by growing yourself so that you will fit into that viewpoint and that dream, or by pulling the dream down, making it not settling, but actually becoming more realistic about what the dream is that you actually have, if that makes any sense. Taxes and money, that's always an issue. It says you have an extra tax if you're self-employed, because you have to now cover your Social Security and your Medicare and all that stuff. Whereas the payroll tax used to come from your employer, now it comes from you. And of course, we all want the money raining down upon us. It's a struggle. Certainly the book marketing thing is, you have to sell a lot of books to make a lot of money. If you're traditionally published, then you get a very small portion of those royalties. If you're self-published, you get a way bigger portion of the royalties, but you have to do all the marketing and distribution yourself. So there's always pros and cons. Balancing everything is, you're working at home, you're at your computer all the time. Temptation can be, I'm going to work 12 hours, and you get in that zone and you realize, oh, no wonder no wonder my back is stiff and I'm hungry, because I've been writing for 12 hours and I haven't looked up. And balancing family and making sure that you're not devoting too much of your life to one thing or another. And it goes the other way too, because you're at your home, there's all these distractions. Maybe you feel like you're working because at your computer, but really you're hanging out on Facebook or you're playing with your dogs or something like that. Rejection, people still get rejection after they're published. They may send something in that their agent says, yeah, I don't think I can sell this. Or James Patterson probably doesn't, because everything he writes will sell. But people still do get rejected at this time, and it's no easier than it was the first time. And then there's the frustration of sometimes when you have to get the words down, but they just don't come, or resistance, which we're going to talk a little bit about later. So those are all some things that you deal with. We're going to see this guy in just a minute when we talk about how to tame resistance. Stephen Pressfield calls it resistance. Some people call it writer's block. Some people say it doesn't exist, but that doesn't help you if you're in the middle of it. I can't go into a long thing on writer's block, but I will say I have an article about it on Medium. If you look up Jaden Terrell, you'll find it. It's the only article I have up there, but it's how to kind of figure out why you have this block or this resistant, and then how to overcome it based on what the reason is. Because resistance always has some kind of meaning. And sometimes it's a problem with the work. You made a mistake somewhere and you realize that you've gone awry and then you have to fix it. Or you may have to go back and unravel some things to find where the problem is. It could be you're grieving. I have a friend who lost his mom, and 2 weeks later he's like, I don't know what's wrong with me, I can't write. And it's because you're grieving. Or someone is suffering from depression, or someone is taking care of their kids and then also their elderly parents and also trying to work a job and they're exhausted. That can cause what you'd call writer block. It's really just exhaustion. So figuring out how, if I want to write, how do I figure out where this is coming from, and then what can I do to mitigate that? What can I change in my life to give myself time? How can I give myself that priority, even if it's only 15 or 20 minutes a day? Once you know why you have it, then you can start to fix it and address it. And then we kind of go back to that. You got this resistance for whatever reason. You got to come down to your why. What is it you want? What will it take to get it? And do you really want it enough to have that? And if you do, then you just have to sit down and go, okay, this might be bad, but I'm going to do it anyway. And this is what I find the most useful. When my brain, I have this every single book. I'll start to write the book, the new book, and I'll be like, what happened to me? I used to be a good writer. My last book was good. This book is terrible. And I said something to my agent when she said, Beth, you do this every single book. And I do, because I'm trying to compare my new first baby draft to my polished final draft. And new writers will do it because they're trying to compare their draft to the published books they see on the shelf. And you have to remind yourself that those books didn't end that way. They didn't start that way. They were the same kind of mushy mess that your first draft probably is too. And so I come up with this idea that if we were artists, if we were sculptors, we would have a big slab of marble or a big slab of clay, and we would do like Michelangelo. We would find the angel in it. Just carve away everything that's not the angel, right? But we don't have any clay because we're writers. We have to make it first. And that's what that first draft is. That's the clay. So when that editor brain starts at you, it's going, that's no good. That's terrible. You're not a good writer. Well, writer brain just shrivels. Writer brain will not play that game. And when editor brain starts nattering at writer brain just kind of retreats. You know how that goes, right? And so we love editor brain. We need her when it's editing time, but we don't need her when it's writing time. And so we have to say, I love you, but you got to go to the beach or something. And I go, it's okay. I'm just making clay. And she said, but it's not good. And I'm like, well, it's not supposed to be good. It's just clay. We'll find the angel in it later. You can make the angel later. We got to make the clay. And then she'll go, well, it's not good. It probably doesn't have an angel in it. It's like, well, we'll find out later. That's your job, is to make the angel. And if it's not an angel, it's going to be a wonderful dragon or a wonderful platypus or whatever this thing is. It'll be wonderful when we get done with it. But you got to go to the beach. Here's some chocolate. Go have fun. We're going to make the clay. And so whenever that editor brain starts to go in and she goes, that's not good. I go, it's okay, because it's not, I'm just making clay. It's not supposed to be good yet. And that helps me more than anything, because I have a very powerful editor brain. And the more editing I do for other people, the more it gets turned on. She gets turned on really hard. And so I have to remind her, it's not your turn yet. We're just got to make the clay first. So that may be helpful if you find yourself kind of falling into that perfection trap. And now we're going to talk about story weaving and story reweaving. But before I do, I want to see if we have any questions. So we have any questions? Anybody? Yes, Janet?
Myself. Yeah, I just wanted to know, you were talking about marketing before, and we've heard from other kind of the people in the kind of mid-level marketing, and they're not the James Pattersons.
Mhm.
How much does your publisher market your stuff, or do you have to be more of a partner in that process?
Most every author I know, including me, has to do most of their marketing. What my publisher does primarily for me now, he sends out press releases, but the main thing that he does that's helpful to me is he gets those reviews from Kirkus and Library Journal and Book List, the big reviewers, and that's the main marketing part that they do, and the rest of it the authors do. That's true for most publishers. If you're with the big five and they give you a massive advance, then there's a pretty good chance they're going to get behind it and do some more promotion for you. But otherwise, you're going to do most of it yourself. And that you mentioned, I think it was one of you mentioned the class I'm going to be doing for National for Sisters in Crime in November. And that's called Sell Your Books, Not Your Soul. And is for writers who know we need to market, but marketing doesn't come natural to us. And sometimes we might have some resistance to it. And so this is sort of here are the options, but here's how you pick the few things that you can consistently do that are a good match for your personality and your interests. Because I think that consistency is huge when it comes to marketing.
I was just going to say, I think that would help us a lot, because some of us are trying to market our latest anthology, and I think we're doing okay given our personalities, but we're not great. I even did PR for a while, and I got to tell you, I'm not in the marketing side of things. I definitely know that. So I'm looking forward to that one.
You do have an advantage in that there's a lot of you, which means that you can cover a lot of different ground, because you probably all have different strengths and different circles and different interests, which you can leverage. And I see Janice seems to have a gift for this with her mausoleum signing and some of the things that she's been doing in her death tour blog. That those are all good things because they seem to be good fits for her personality and the things that she's interested in doing. So we'll get into that. But we're taking 2 weeks. It's a full day class, really, workshop, but we're dividing it into 2 shorter ones. But you can get the basics of it there. Just like what we're doing right here is essentially we're doing my story, but we're also doing 2 full day workshops. So we're squishing down. And we had talked about, as soon as this COVID thing is over, me coming there in person and doing one or both of those workshops there, if there's interest, so that you can kind of get the groundwork here. But if you want to go more in depth, we could do that then.
People may remember that Jaden Terrell was our national speaker. She was gifted to us for this year to do the workshop for the day, but then COVID happened. So we didn't get her physical presence, but we've got this little mini worksheet or workshop. So hopefully we'll get her maybe next year for something live.
I'm coming as soon as this thing is over, if y'all want me.
We'll take you.
Yeah, whether National says yes or not, I'll just get in my car and drive. But because I love teaching and I love talking about stuff like that. So I'm going to talk first about story weaving. And again, this is a real full day workshop, but I'm going to show you at least enough to kind of get you started. And then we can talk about the revision process. And I've got a handout for the revision part. And I also, I also do this Monday live on Facebooks for a group called Spirit of Ink. And it's free for writers if they want to come. And it's just encouragement for writers and inspirational quotes. And I put up, if there's a call for an anthology that somebody sends me, I put that up, or call for submissions or story markets. And then we do sharing times on Friday where everybody shares what they did that week, just to kind of keep everybody's emotions up. And some of this I do on Mondays for free. So the story weaving, when you're actually writing the story, everybody will say there's pantsers and there's plotters, which there are, but there's also plantsers, which is, I think, where most people fall. You do a certain amount of planning and a certain amount of it arises organically. Because even the most right by the seat of their pants authors who actually finish books and are able to revise them into something else, most of them have some ideas about these touch points of where they're going to get to. And so there's a certain amount of planning involved, and then they just write from point to point, and they allow themselves to change it as they can. And so their first draft, in many cases, a true plantser's first draft is sort of like the plotter's outline. You end up both getting there. Stephen King is a pantser through and through. Jeffrey Deaver is a plotter through and through. Jeffrey Deaver might have a 61-page outline when he's done, and they both have really great books. So there's no wrong way to do it. There's no right way to do it, but most people do a little bit of both, and I fall into that category. I have a plan. That plan will change and shift as I go, but I feel better when I have it because I know I'm not, that at least I have a shape of a book that I'm not going to write myself into a corner 200 pages down the road and have to throw it out. So I always end up having to change a lot of stuff, but the basic shape of it usually stays about the same. So the sort of system that I'm going to give you starts with writing just a tagline. Who is the character? What is their issue? What are they willing to, what's at stake for them? What are they going to have to overcome to get their goal? And that kind of gives you something to cling to, a little basic shape so that you know what the focus is, so that you don't ramble off into these crazy subplots. You can, but you got to keep in mind what the goal is so that you know you can allow yourself to explore, but you don't get so out in the weeds that you lose track of the book you were trying to write. So I'm going to show you one that I'm using. This is a secret preview because it's the first book of what I hope will be a new series that my agent and I are talking about, and I'm trying to get it to her this fall. So you're getting a little sneak preview of it. And here is the tagline. 10 years after surviving her capture by a brutal serial killer, a young martial arts instructor must risk the safe new life she's built to save a missing woman from a predator protected by charm, wealth, and celebrity. So we know who it is. She's a young martial arts instructor. We know what she's risking. She's made this new life where she doesn't have to be afraid, and she's going to risk that in order to save. This is a missing woman. It's one of her students. And we even know that the predator is probably somebody who's going to be pretty daunting because he's got charm, he's got wealth, he's got celebrity. So this may never make it into any official stuff, but this gives me an idea, like this is my lodestone, this is my compass, and this is my true north. And everything that I do that ultimately ends up in the book needs to serve this. Jess Lowry did a workshop where she talked about this, and she mentioned the A story and the B story. And both of those should be in this little tagline or this little distillation that you do. I used to think that the A story was the main plot and the B story was the big subplot, but that's not true. The A story is your surface story. It's the plot of the thriller, the plot of your mystery, the puzzle. The B story is your character's internal journey. And so here we have the A story. Clearly, student's been taken by a serial killer. Main character has to save her or try to save her. The B story is her desire for safety that's holding her kind of back or tying her to this new life. She's constructed safety, and she's not living in fear per se, but she's closed off a lot of her life in order to minimize risk. And in this book, she has to take that journey to live courageously and risk that safety for somebody else. So that's really her B story, is the letting go of that trauma from her time spent with this serial killer. So that's where I start with that tagline. And then I grow it to a paragraph. And the paragraph covers the whole arc of the book. It might change, a lot of it will change, but it just gives me an idea of these are the main points. Because usually when you start a book, you have ideas of a few scenes in your head that are going to take you from A to B. So then I make it that full paragraph. And from there, it becomes a page. And from there, I can start doing some like index cards, laying them out, storyboarding, that kind of thing. But after the one-page synopsis, and sometimes even after the one paragraph, I start to do this groundwork. And I do a lot of groundwork. Elizabeth George has a book on the craft of writing, and she talks about this, how much groundwork she does. It's very similar. And when I'm writing a mystery, particularly a thriller, the timelines are so important, and I have no sense of time. So I have to make a lot of timelines. But I also am very character driven, and so I like to address character early. I like to get to know the character, because character kind of drives the story. So when I do this groundwork, I might do character interviews. I have a book. It's the big book of whatever character I'm working on. Like for my PI series, it's the big book of Jared. And I have things about his character that I know that may come into play. How many siblings does he have? What does he look like? So I don't change his eye color or his hair color later in the series. What's important to him? And as I'm writing the series, anything that I think is going to come back later is going to be really relevant, I'll put in this book. But I also have the floor plan of the house he lives in. I also have, if I see something in a magazine, oh, that's a good jacket, he would wear that jacket, and I might get that. Or if I have an article that gives some insight into it, I put in that book. The setting, I want to know enough about the setting to know what are some of the smaller settings, the micro settings, and what's the major setting, and how will that affect the plot maybe? And what are some of the atmospheric things in the setting? I set a lot of things in Nashville because I live here, and then I can drive to them and actually see what they look like. And then I do the anatomy of the crime. Some people like to write the book and then figure out who did it. I tend to like to know what happened first, because different people have different habits and mindsets and patterns and perceptions and proclivities. And so if two different people were going to kill the same person, they would do it differently, and they would try to cover it up differently. So to me, the killer's motivation and the killer's MO per se, like what weapon would this person choose? Would it be the same weapon that other person would choose? What, how would they think to try and cover it up? One person might go very elaborate, create a false alibi, forge tickets to the opera, or something like that. Another character might do it more, like go subterfuge by trying to throw light, like frame another person. And so to me, knowing who did it and what really happened helps me a lot in terms of making it all fit together. My fourth Jared book, I realized pretty early that I didn't know who the killer was. I thought I did. It's the only time this has ever happened to me. But that meant at every turning point, there were 3 people it could have been. And at every turning point, I had to say, okay, if it's this person, why did they do it this way? And how did they do it? And if it's this person, why did they do it this way? And how did they do it? And I had to figure out kind of what they would have done differently so that Jared could perceive it the same way no matter which one had done it, if that makes sense. Because it had to be in character for them, for all of them, to do that in whatever happened. But there would be a different reason for each of them. If there's a character who dies about a quarter of the way through, they don't all have the same reason for killing that person. They would all have different motivations. and therefore it would happen a little bit differently, but it has to have happened in a way that would leave the same clues. So that was pretty challenging for me. I hope it never happens again. But I do want to know enough about what happened really in the crime so that I can make the clues and the characters fit it. And I usually have the characters first, and then I decide how they would die, or I kind of meld them together. And then I have a chart, suspects, clues, and red herrings, and I have a timeline, so make it sure that every one of those suspects could have done it, and that every one of them did have some kind of motivation. And red herrings, I don't apply from above. They all grow from who are these people and why do they want this person dead, and those become the red herrings, kind of just organically. And then I figure out who are the allies that my character has. I write a series in the Jared series, so I know who his regular allies are, but he may sometimes need somebody at the DMV. He may have a undercover, not an undercover, but like a snitch that he used to work with when he was a cop, who would be an unreliable ally. And I decide based on the story and what it needs, who those allies are going to have to be and whether they're going to be reliable. And then I storyboard it. And when I say that, I just mean I take index cards. You can use Excel or you can use Post-its, whatever. And I figure out what my major turning points are. And I just put I don't stress that I have to have exactly 60 scenes or whatever, but I do say, all right, what are some of the scenes that I know I'm going to have, and I put them in a reasonable order. And then there may be gaps in between that I can fill in as I go, or there may be something I get to a point and writer brain goes, I have something better. And more likely to tell me I have something better if I have something already down, because that gives them a jumping off place. And so I can just throw that index card away and put in a new one. And that gives me both the structure of an outline, but the flexibility to shift as I need to, as the story demands it. Some people's characters are more well-behaved than mine are. And some people's plots emerge more strongly than mine do. But mine tend to come, I have this idea, but it doesn't have all the layering to it yet. And so as I write, there's a lot that develops. And I need to be able to make that shift and not be married to the first idea that I had. So I think that's why some people don't like outlines, because they think it holds them rigidly to this plan. But to me, an outline is just a map that I have. Like, I'm going to go from here to a specific address in Wisconsin, and a map will get me there, but I can still take detours if I need to, or I can decide on another route. I could say I'm going to go this way, but I'm still going to end up there, but I'm free to take these other detours if I need to, because I have the general, I know Wisconsin is this direction from where I am now, so I can keep myself kind of straight. I'm going to see now if I have questions. Maybe. I'm not seeing it. Janet, will you guys watch to see if there's questions come up in the chat that I need to be paying? Oh, wait, more maybe?
I'll keep an eye on that for
Okay,
you.
so I just want to make sure that I don't
Yeah.
miss anything.
No, I think the last question was mine, and
Okay.
Hawthorne was just talking about on one of your points, light posts in the fog, where you know some of the points, but you don't know if the path to the lights is winding or straight. And that sounded just really, really interesting. And
Yeah.
I posted a link on here to that piece you wrote on Medium about writer's block.
Thank you. That's the headlights. E.L. Doctorow said that writing a book is like driving a dark road in the fog. You can only see as far as your headlights, but that's all you need. And this guy, whoever wrote that, did a wonderful job of extending that simile to explain it even more. Like, you don't necessarily know how it's going, but you'll get there eventually, because you kind of know which direction you need to go. Story reweaving, because this is how this beautiful, beautiful piece of weaving is how we imagine our first draft is going to come out to be. wouldn't that be wonderful if it came out perfect? But usually it's like this, really. And that's, or in my metaphor, is a big slab of clay. So once you have this tangle of the story, or this, a lot of people have a mushy middle. Some people are closer to their end product than others, but I think most of us have a significant amount of work to do after our initial draft. Like, I have the big slab of clay. I know there's an angel in it somewhere. But here's what I find, that if I try to edit as I go, particularly when I was beginning writing, I could not finish anything, because it'd be like I'd spend all this time trying to find a little piece of wing, and then maybe there wouldn't be enough clay left for the rest of the angel, or, you know, I just hadn't planned it out as well. But I would also, I could not go on to chapter 2 until chapter 1 was perfect. I could not go on to paragraph 2 until paragraph 1 was perfect. And it wasn't until I gave myself permission to just, like, I'm going to make the clay first, then I can find the angel. That's the only way I was ever able to finish a book. I do it a little differently now that I have 5 of them under my belt. Now I kind of tell myself I can go forward. I can edit if I've gone forward. This is, my editor brain and writer brain work together better now than they used to. So if I've done my 1,000 words or 2,000 words or whatever I needed to do in the day, then I can go back and I can edit what came before. Because it's like writer brain has done their playing, and now editor brain can come and do the cleanup on what came before. But I would not do that if you're someone who struggles with perfectionism. If you turn that editor brain on hard, it's hard to turn it off again. And some people have a real struggle with that. If your writer brain and editor brain work well together, then you might be able to do that. It's what Dean Wesley Smith calls cycling, because I go forward and then I can go back a little bit. And that way, by the time I get to the end, my beginning is pretty clean, because I've gone back over it a lot of times.
Beth, we do have one question, if I could kind of throw it out there. Do you use any kind of writing software? That's Lily Evans asking that question.
I have Scrivener, and I used it for Taste of Blood and Ashes, which is book 4 in the Jared series, but mostly I just use Word. I find that it's easy for me to use. A lot of times I'll write something in Word, and then when I'm ready to revise, I might move it into Scrivener, like 1 chapter at a time. I like Scrivener, but there's something about it that is a little distracting to me, and I think it's because the thing is in pieces, which makes it way easier to find things. So in Scrivener, I can name the title, the chapter, so I can know exactly what's happening there, and I can go straight to it. Oh, I need to work on that chapter with the shotgun, and I can go straight to it. But I started with Word, and so I think that's why I tend to gravitate to that. But I also have this thing. It's my husband got me an iPad, and there's an app in it called Nebo. And if you have the Apple Pen, you can write longhand, and it will type it for you and turn it into a Word document. And I love that, because there's something, they've even done studies about this, there's something about writing by hand that kind of unleashes creativity and helps you to get rid of that editor side of you that kind of yells at you. It's almost like the editor thing, when it types up and it looks like a book, she's a little bit harder on it than if I'm writing by hand. It's like, if I'm writing by hand, she's like, oh, you're nowhere near ready for me yet, darling.
I wonder if I could jump in with a,
yeah.
I don't like to write by hand, but I have a 1935 Remington Model 5 portable typewriter that I inherited from my father-in-law. And there are times that I turn over here and write on the typewriter for a while, and then I can scan it in. Yeah. And it does a pretty good job of scanning in, but I write on the typewriter.
I like that you brought that up, because sometimes changing the medium can really help. In that first draft, you get stuck one way. If I've been writing on the computer, I'll start writing longhand, maybe in a spiral notebook or on that Nebo. But if I'm writing by hand and I get stuck, I'll go back to the computer. And you're doing the same thing with the typewriter. You're changing your medium, which shifts your brain a little bit and can sometimes get you around a problem or an issue. So I have 2 different analogies for you about revision. Revision is a layer cake. That's the first one. The cake is the story. That filling, that delicious filling, is your scene structure. Then your icing is your language and the fluency of it. And then those little decorations, the icing roses, that's your proofreading and your final polish. They're all important, but you can't really put the roses on until you've made the cake. And you can't put the filling in until you've made the cake. And you don't put the icing in until you've done both the filling and the, so when you revise in those layers. Some people, when they start their revision and editing, they start with the sugar roses because they're working at the sentence level. And two things happen when they do that. First of all, they lose track of the big picture because they're thinking in the micro area. But they also, once it is time to look at the big revision, it's hard to let go of a scene that you have polished and polished and polished. And if you find out that there's a big chunk that doesn't belong there, that you have to take out, some people will find it very, very difficult to remove those. It's also harder to see if it doesn't belong there, if it's really, really well written and polished, because it blends in a little bit better. It feels finished. It feels like good writing, and therefore it's harder to see if it doesn't move the story forward in the right direction. So if you start by fixing the cake first and then move through these layers, it's easier to actually revise the book. And then for those of you who don't like the cake analogy, it is also like building a new house. Your first draft, you've got your raw materials, your wood and your shingles and all that, your wires, and your story is the foundation of the house. And then your scene structure, your bricks, your walls, your wiring. And then the language and the fluency, those architectural flourishes and the color schemes and the landscaping. And then the last is that trim and the finishing touches, your proofreading and final polish. And again, you can't do that part until you already have your foundation, and you can't do your bricks and walls till you have your foundation, etc. So when we revise, we start from the big and go down to the small. We start from the foundation and move to the polish. Does that make sense to everybody? So let's look at the story layer. And I'm going to exit this because there's something I want you to see in a minute. So the story layer, I had originally called it story structure, but it's more than just the structure of the story. It's the structure of the story, it's the pacing, it's the character development, and it's whether or not there's enough tension in it. And I do a read just for that. So the first thing I do when I'm finished is set it aside for a little while, and I might do some research. I might just do brainstorming for other books. I might start another book. I might do some reading instead. But I will do something that is not handling this book. And maybe it's going to be a couple of days, maybe it's going to be a week. Some people will do it longer, but a week is usually about right enough for me to then go back and see it kind of new. And I will just read it from beginning to end, and I'll jot down notes about, oh, I see, why did they do this here? Why did they do this there? I see a plot hole here. Oh, this doesn't seem like him. Some people even need to read once for plot and once for character. Just have to kind of know your own ability as to whether you can absorb them both at the same time or whether you need to focus on one. But I'm going to step out of this so that I can show you this. So this is just a little, it's going to be a handout. You'll get it. And it's just a list of kind of ways, things to look at in each of these layers. So first you celebrate and you rest. And then you're asking, does this make sense? Does everything make sense? Does the storyline hold together? Does one thing lead logically from one thing to the next thing? Or do you find there's big gaps in the narrative? Have we gone from, I'm sitting in the living room, or I'm in a taxi cab talking to Cousin Joe, and then all of a sudden I'm in a cave with Sally. How did I get there? Did I get a big gap? Is there enough happening? Sometimes we think there's things happening, but from the reader side, they're so incremental that it feels slow. Have you taken every reasonable opportunity to make things worse? We often want to be really kind to our characters. So we love them. And so it's hard to make them suffer as much as the book might demand that they suffer. I've read stories where they introduce plenty of problems, but they solve them almost immediately. One of the worst examples I ever read, it was in a women's magazine. It was a condensed novel. And essentially, this woman, this young girl wanted to go to college, but she didn't have any money. Now, that's a really good premise. And then somebody came, this man came, he's an older man. He had no nefarious motivations. He just knew she was a bright young woman, and so he gave her the money to go to college. So as soon as that problem was introduced, it was solved. And then when she got to college, she was trying to make ends meet by being a seamstress, and she couldn't afford a sewing machine. So somebody immediately gave her a sewing machine. And then she, instead of struggling to make this ends meet, she immediately became a very successful seamstress, made tons of money, became an entrepreneur, everything wonderful. Meets a guy, she's afraid he won't like her. Oh, but he does. Every single problem introduced was immediately solved. And I think that's probably because the writer really liked the character and wanted things to turn out well for her. Or else when they condensed it, they took out all the conflict and just gave you the good parts. So that's a wonderful life. We all want that life, but it's not a very compelling story. So we have to be like, how can this be worse? As we're writing the book, we think that, does this make sense? What's the next logical thing that could happen? And how could this be worse? And you have to stop before you reach that point of Susie Maribel running across the snow in her bare feet with her baby in her arms and the wolves coming after her. You don't want to get that kind of melodramatic, but you do want to be like, could I make this worse? Would that be reason? Would that make it better? Like, was the more powerful thing? Is there a moment of no turning back? I have read a number of client books where you're 3/4 in and the character's like, I don't really want to do this anymore. And they literally could walk away if things are getting hard. And then for some reason they don't walk away, but it's not very compelling because they could if they wanted to. So there has to be a point early on where that character, either for external reasons or for their internal reasons, they can't stop. Maybe it's a commitment to somebody else or to a memory of someone, or it's a moral code like Harry Bosch has this code, everybody matters or nobody matters. And he lives by that code so strongly that once he's involved in a case and he engages with the victim, he's not leaving no matter what. And that's such an inherent part of his personality that his no turning back moment comes pretty early in the book, and you know he is never backing down no matter what. Are you making the most of those turning points? Are they correctly placed? I think we talked, and maybe we didn't, but we should have, about when you're writing your book and you're making your outline, you have turning points about 1/4 of the way, halfway, 3/4 of the way. Our brains are wired for a certain kind of story. It's not a formula, but if you get more than 1/4 of the way through your book and you haven't had some kind of major shift, readers start to feel like nothing's happening. So there's an unlimited number of things that could happen. And you can have turning points earlier, but you have to have major ones at those points, or the reader they feel something off. So have you put it, they don't have to be exact. It's not like you have to go with a ruler notes. This is word number this on this page, but it needs to be in about those places. So are you making the most of those, and are they in the right places? If you put your big turning point at 1/8 of the way instead of 1/4 of the way, then you got to come something else, a new one at 1/4 of the way, because otherwise that 1/8 is not going to carry them all the way halfway through. You need to keep the one you have at 1/8 if it needs to be, but then make sure you have another one at the 1/4 point. Are there places where you need more development? Where are you spinning your wheels? Are you rambling? Are you things like that? I've heard there are putter-inners and there are taker-outers. And there are people who are in between. But the putter-inners are people who write thin and the first draft is sort of outliney in its feeling, and then they have to go put in the fleshing out and the extra layers and maybe more development or more description that you might read in some ways a little bit like a screenplay. But those writers write real thin, and then they put in the new details, and then the taker-outers write big, and sometimes they ramble, and sometimes they get wordy and that kind of thing. And then when they edit, they squeeze it down and distill it into the nice, wonderful book. You can't tell the final product, which is which. It's a process thing. And then some of us will find, this is how I do it, I find parts of it are too thin and I got to flesh them out, and parts are too bloated and wordy and I have to distill them down. And this is what this question is about. Like, where do you need more development and where do you need less? Is the pacing right? Do you have too much backstory, or did you put it too early? Sometimes writers want to just like, here are all the things that you need to know in the whole book. I'm going to give it to you all now. Here's this person's whole life. And sometimes it's better just to weave that in. Usually I think it's better to weave it in than to just dump it on us all at once. In your first draft, don't worry about these things. In your first draft, you can put that backstory in, but when you revise it, figure out where can you place it that might be more effective. These are things that as you write more, you'll find that they come more naturally to you and you don't have to think about them so much, and they'll appear more in the first draft, but don't stew about them, because that's all part of making the clay. And then I love computers because now I can move things where they need to be and I don't have to retype the whole book. And I don't have to sit down and cut things out and tape them down. Is there good ebb and flow, or does everything move at the same speed? Sometimes, people want something happening every second. There's a car chase, and then there's explosion, and then there's a shooting, and then there's a fight, and then there's this. And so everything is at the same level. It's a really heightened, hyper level, but with no changes in it, like a moment for the character to breathe and the reader to kind of internalize what just happened. That can be just as boring as if nothing happens at all. Because we tend, as humans, we get used to things really easily. And it's like olfactory fatigue, when you smell something and it's like skunk, and then after a while your nose gets used to it, you can't smell it anymore. The same thing kind of happens to us when we're reading a book and everything is all the same level. So have you guys seen that graph of where they're talking about showing the tension going up the stakes, and then at the end a little denouement? And then sometimes you see it with the jagged peaks. The jagged peaks are more realistic for what you do in the book, because here's some stakes, here's some tension, it goes up, and then there's a little moment where the character gets to take a breath. Oh, we got away from him. Oh wait, but here's something else, and it's even a little bit worse. Okay, we got a moment. Let's have let's sit down and talk about what we've learned. Oh, wait a minute, we better go run because here's the bad guy coming. And those little breathers and those little transitions between give your reader the variety that they need. So there's some scenes that need to be that fast-paced action, and then there are some scenes that need to be a little more thoughtful and insightful. I think it's Dwight Swain who talks about the the scene in the sequel. And essentially what that just means is, once you've had a scene where something happens, give your character a chance to react to it, and then make a new plan, and then maybe a new goal, so that it doesn't all feel one level. Are there places where the story lags or feel rushed? Does it feel thin? Does it feel thick? Do you have the right balance of exposition and dialogue and action? Do you have the right balance of plot and character? Some writers are very character driven, some are very plot driven. So if you're really character driven, you might find yourself in that same situation I was in, where it was very thin plot, a lot of character. And then I had to go back and fix that. When you are more plot driven, it may be that you have that hard driving plot, and then when you revise it, you have to go in and put in all those layers of character. Again, that's just process, because when you get to the end of the book and it's all done, often you can't tell which was which. Do you have too many characters? Do you have not enough characters? Are they consistent? One of the things Daniel Keyes said to me was, he wrote Flowers for Algernon. It was very helpful to me. Don't ever make your character do something they wouldn't do. And I was really struggling with that my first chapter of my book, because my character had to do something that was a little bit out of character for him, which was to go off with a one-night stand with a woman. That's really not in his character. He tends to be more monogamous when he's in a relationship. So I had to figure out, rather than just imposing that on him, I had to figure out what are his triggers, what would make him vulnerable to a situation like that. And that is when I came up with this idea: a battered woman comes in and into the bar. He's immediately protective, and that lowers a lot of his reservations, lowers his resistance and his barriers. And then he shows a picture of his son. This is like a litmus test for him. He has a son with Down syndrome. And so she's like, "You have any kids?" And he's like, "Yeah." She shows this picture, and he's watching her face to see, is she put off by this? And if so, that's a red flag to him. But no, she's like, "Oh, I have a cousin who has Downs. They're so cute." So that lowers his resistance even more. So that hook in the beginning that he had to do this thing becomes more believable, because things unfold in such a way that his resistance is already lowered and he's more susceptible to doing it. But originally, because I was just trying to make him do this thing I needed him to do for the plot, it didn't work. Once I was able to give him a motivation that was realistic for him, it did. Are they heroic enough? I sometimes will read a manuscript where a character is very passive. And the goal of the writer is to show them becoming more decisive as they go along. But for most of the book, they're kind of a milquetoast and they don't really do anything. That's hard to pull off in a book. We have to see that the character is active, not just reactive. And then, but are they also flawed? Sometimes characters are so perfect that they don't seem believable. Are they multidimensional? I'm not going to read all of these because you're going to see them yourself when you get the handout, but that's the story layer. And then you go through that whole manuscript correcting those problems. Storyboarding is a huge way. Now, Janet, you asked, how did I fix the problem with the plot in the beginning? And this is what I did. I took index cards and I color coded them. And white was the plot, the main mystery plot. And yellow had to do with his son, Paul, his son with Down syndrome. Purple had to do with his nephew, Josh, who has come out of the closet and run away from home because there's problems in his family. One is his ex-wife, and has holding on to that relationship and trying, because they're both still in love with each other, but they have very different needs and they don't fit. So I had all of these different subplots going on that are related to his character and his personality, his horses. And they had taken over the book. And so when I went through every scene, and here's what happens in this scene, and this is the color it is. It's main plot, it's Paul, it's this, it's this, it's this. And when I got done, I had this stack of index cards. It was beautiful. It was all these colors, and it had a little bits of white kind of going through it. I was like, I see, visually, I could see what my problem was. It was completely, the balance was completely wrong. So that's when I had to go back and I had to distill the character part and do the bump up the plot part. And when I got finished, I did it again. And then I had a white stack with the colors going through it like it should. And I could also even see, all right, I don't have all my yellows in one place. All my Paul stuff is not in one place. It's nicely spaced through, so that I could sort of visually see the structure of the subplots. And that, yes, I did make sure that instead of them all in one place, they're nicely dispersed throughout. So you can do that with Post-its or Excel sheet or whatever, but it's really helpful if you have a plot problem. And another thing you can do is brainstorm with a friend or another writer. Another writer is good, where you can find those plot holes. Like, okay, I need this to happen, but this is what happened before. How can I fix that? That's really helpful. Let's see. Okay, the pacing problem. That's where you figure out what the pacing is. Ask yourself, do I need to add scenes? Take them out. weave in my backstory instead of dumping them in one place. A lot of times a pacing problem can be fixed by using a more immediate point of view. And the immediate point of view is also like close point of view. What I find happens a lot of times is in an action scene, or if a person goes to a critique group and they say, this is a slow story, it's going too slow. It drags. What they do is take out all the, like the internal monologue, and they take out a lot of the sensory details, and they end up with just choreography. I hit him, he hit me, we rolled around on the floor. Then we punch each other a few more times. And so you have the choreography, and it's really boring because it's just event, 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 event. Whereas if you put in those details, Donald Moss says pick a few sensory details and a few like internal monologues that they might think during this fight or this action scene or whatever scene it is. And it will make that scene come to life. And so even if it's longer, it will feel like it moves better. And you don't want to overdo it. But if you have just choreography, it is going to feel crazy slow. And that's counterintuitive because a lot of times they're just trying to make it go fast. So it's like, here's the events. But it's slow to read because we're not immersed. Essentially, that's where they fall into telling me what happened rather than putting me in the scene. And when you put them in the scene, it takes longer, but it feels faster. Does that make sense? I've got some examples I can send you in the handouts, but I don't want to read them to you now or anything like that. But I can show you the difference between like, here's an event, and here's what happens when you actually allow it to unfold with the character's thoughts and physical sensations. And then ensuring the plot turns, which we talked about. Stop me if you have questions or something. And if you have a character problem, I think getting to know them at a deeper level is really important. I like to do character interviews so that I can say, okay, what happened next? How did you feel about that? When I'm first getting to know a character, I might say, do you have other, I asked Jared once, I know you have this brother Randall, do you have any other siblings? And he said, I don't want to talk about that. And I knew that he had one and he didn't know it yet, but he didn't want to go there. So I also knew that it had something to do with his dad, whom he idolizes, being in the war and having another family at that time in Vietnam. So doing that interview can tell you a lot about the character, even sometimes things they're not ready to reveal to you yet, or they may not even know about themselves. Using a more immediate POV will also really help with character development because we feel like we are the character as opposed to just being told about them. And then the Daniel Keyes thing, never make them do something they wouldn't do. If you have to have your character do something they would never do, then you have to figure out a way to make them overcome their resistance to it. Or to, like, let's say, I used to use this, I use this in a workshop I do all the time. What would make this person who's afraid of heights go across this suspension bridge? And one woman said, never, nothing will do it. Nothing will make her go. I said, okay, what if there's a serial killer on the other side and they have her daughter at knife point and they've got a knife at her throat? And if she doesn't cross that suspension bridge, he's going to kill her daughter. Would she go then? And most everybody's like, oh yeah, she would go. This woman's like, no, she's not going no matter what. And I said, okay, that's a fine decision to make. But then she has to live with that. That becomes a part of the plot. She can't overcome her fear and her daughter is killed because of it. Now what does she do? So the rest of that story takes a huge shift. That it now becomes she has to overcome her fear by the end of the book so that she can take down this killer and maybe protect other people and, and come to grips with what she wasn't able to do. The scene layer then. Does anybody have questions about the story layer before we move on here? No? Okay. All right, so the scene layer. Every scene needs to have a single arc. That means basically that the scene is driving toward a certain ending from the beginning. The reader may not know what it's driving toward, but they can feel like it's moving towards something. And when they reach that point in the scene, you can feel it. You're like, okay, this has been fulfilled. Sometimes writers will then continue the scene so that you end up with a scene that has a shape like this, the double hump or the triple hump. You know, so they just keep going and going and going. And what that does when you keep going at the point at which it has achieved its end is that you bury it. You bury that moment at which the whole thing is going to, and it begins to feel draggy. So sometimes if you have a scene that just seems to go on and on and on and on and on, maybe there's a place in it that actually is the actual scene or chapter end. And then if you just start the new one there, it has a nice arc of its own too. So you might end up with two really nicely shaped scenes instead of one that just seems to drag on forever. You want to ground it in time and place. You want your reader to always know when and where they are. The character needs to want something in the scene, and preferably every character does. So maybe my detective wants to find a certain piece of information and the other character doesn't want to give it to them. But they're both trying to get something, and at the end they've either achieved it or they haven't. Nancy Picard talked about this terrific thing called casts. She got it from somebody else. I'm not sure who she got it from, but it's an acronym. And she says every character needs these things. They need the C, which is character. So if a scene, what you're calling a scene, doesn't have any people in it or anthropomorphized animals or whatever, a living being that is participating in it, it's not really a scene. It's just a description or an essay or using or something, exposition, but it's not a scene. It also needs some action. Something has to be happening. So it doesn't have to be a car scene, like a car chase or a bomb, but there has to be movement in the scene. If you're having a conversation, for example, between, let's say, a mother and a daughter, let them be doing something. They could be fixing a car, they could be washing dishes, they could be, but what that does is give you movement that you can use. Imagine if you're watching a video or a play, you wouldn't just have the heads like this, it's not radio. You can use like the flick of a towel or slamming down a cup as to emphasize what they're saying and thinking. So it's not just a boring two people talking. There are things happening and there's movement going on. The S is some kind of sensory details. The T is a turn. So the character or the story is in a different place at the end of the scene than it is at the beginning. Something has shifted or turned. And then the last S is a surprise, some kind of surprise. It doesn't have to be like big killer clown jumping out of a cake, but it does have to be something where the oh, I didn't know that, or And then if you have all of those things and a good arc and tension in it, you've probably got a good scene. And then the endings, the scenes all end in a certain way. And if you have it, there's sort of like, think about it as a short story. It has its own arc. But instead of like in a short story, it ends, in the book, it has a little hook that pulls the reader on to make them want to read the next chapter. It may be a cliffhanger. It's probably not always going to be one, or it might feel a little bit melodramatic, but something that makes the reader go, oh, I got to see what they do about this, or, oh, that's interesting. Let me see what happens. There's 4 different ways you can end a scene. The first one is the yes and way. I think I got this from Donald Moss. Yes, the character gets what they want, and furthermore, they get another good thing. That's obviously the lowest level of tension you can have because everything ends good. Every now and then you have to have that happen, especially if you're setting them up for something really bad in the next one. But use sparingly. Then there's the yes, but. Yeah, they got what they wanted, but there's a complication they didn't really expect, or something has gotten worse now instead. Oh, it led me in a way I didn't expect. Then there's the no, but. no, they didn't get what they wanted, but they did get this other thing that helps them along. And then there's the no and. No, they didn't get what they wanted, and furthermore, things are worse than they were when they started. So all of those things, the first one doesn't have a lot of a hook, but though you can give it one, but the other two have more tension, three have more tension in them. And as Donald Moss says, you want your tension on every page, and he suggests throwing your manuscript up in the air and picking a page at random and figuring out a way to infuse it with more tension. Now, we had a wonderful conversation in New York about tension and what it is and what it isn't. And one of the authors said, I can always tell in the book the point where the author's saying, I have to make the reader feel tension. I'm putting tension here. And I said, but I don't necessarily think that tension is something you should be able to see as like a formula thing like that. The tension is not, it's a feeling you evoke in the reader. So when Don says put tension on every page, what he's saying, I think, is put something on that page that the reader should really care about, that should make them care enough to want to turn that page and find out what happens. So when he says tension on every page, he means have something on every page that is going to create a sense of tension in the reader so that they need to turn that page in order to get the tension resolved. And as you're writing your book, you're maintaining, you're keeping a level of tension that whenever you resolve one thing, you have already introduced something else that will continue to pull them through. Does that make sense to you guys? Cool. Okay, I'm going to assume so unless somebody hollers. And then the next level is that language and fluency. So these things that have an X on them are things that you want to not have. Randomness and repetition. Now, randomness, you can read a book like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe that seems like random things are happening. But as a reader, I feel like it is a controlled randomness. It's something that happens because it is meant to happen. And that works because I always felt like that author was completely in charge of the random things that were happening. When I'm talking about randomness in your manuscript, I'm talking about the kind of thing that it happens out of nowhere and the reader feels like the writer is not in control of it. I always want my readers to feel like they're in good hands. And so when I'm repeating things, you can repeat something like that wonderful Winston Churchill quote about we will fight on the beaches, we will fight in the woods, we will fight here, here, here. That's an intentional repetition. What you don't want is a kind of repetition that feels like you just forgot you said something before. So that's what you want to watch out for. You should look for meaningless gestures. There are times when a shrug or a frown is the perfect thing for the writer to do, or a nod for the character to do. But we often rely really heavily on those gestures. And often it means that we needed some sort of beat there. We needed a pause, or we need a moment to indicate either that the character is having a reaction to something, or to give the reader a moment to absorb what just happened before it. So we need something there. But you go back and you see that you have 782 nods. You might have to change some of those nods to something a little more meaningful. And there are a lot of other gestures. If you go out and observe people out in the wild and kind of see what actual movements do they make with their hands, what facial expressions do they make, and you can replace some of them with a little internal monologue as well. That's a really good technique or tool for your toolbox. Oops. Filler words, that, overused words, we all have. I have a list of filler words that you'll get in your handout, but you probably all could add to that list. That is a big one, but not the only one. You can probably take out not all of the that's, but some of them, probably a lot of them, unless you've just trained yourself already to do that. Overused words will tend to have a word or phrase that is, we tend to overuse it a lot. And it may be different from book to book, but if you realize that you've used the word metamorphosis a whole bunch of times, and that's the characters go to. If all the characters are talking about going through a metamorphosis all the time, maybe you're overusing that one. So each writer will have their own list, the ones that they tend to overuse and that they need to look for. And I do that as a search. And I just look for them one at a time and go, can I get rid of that? Is there a better way to write this so that I don't need this word? You look for wordiness, cut that out. Showing and telling. When do you show? When do you tell? You show when it's important for the reader to go through that scene with the character. You tell when it's the kind of, you need to collapse time. I don't need to know every single thing the character does to make their peanut butter sandwich or to get in the cab and go across town. Maybe I could just say 20 minutes later he arrived at blah. That's telling, but I don't need the whole thing. If you showed every second of your character's life, it would be a really boring book. And you would also not know, the reader would not know the difference between the things that really matter and are important, the key moments, versus the ones that are just filler. So show the things you need to show, get really involved, sensory details, close, immediate point of view, and then tell the pieces that get us between those. The rhythm and the flow of the language, how does it sound? Readers, a lot of times we read with our ears. And so even something as simple as rewriting a sentence so that the stronger word is at the end of the sentence. Let's see. There was a wound in his head and a trickle of blood streamed down, or streamed down it. That's kind of a weak, but a trickle of blood streamed from his head, or a rivulet of blood trickles from his head. Probably trickling and streaming are not the same, but but you get the idea that the head is stronger, or blood would be a stronger word if you can rewrite it that way. So if you have sentences where there are really weak words that are it, and articles and vague ones, you might want to see if you can reframe that sentence. You also kind of look at sentence patterns so that you don't have exactly the same sentence pattern all the time. I have a good friend who's a really good short story writer. He tries to make sure that he never has the same sentence structure twice in a row unless he's doing it on purpose for effect. And that's a really good way to do it too. The dialogue do's and don'ts, there's tons of them. I actually have a course on that. But one of the things is the Hardy Boy syndrome, where you never say said. You whisper and mutter and ejaculate and all that other stuff. When said and asked are mostly what you use. They're mostly invisible, and then you just use the other ones when you need to convey that something was, how something was said, or that it was said in a way that contradicts the words themselves. So if somebody says, I love you sweetly, you might not need that sweetly, or I love you, she, that's an adverb thing. I love you, she said is fine, but like if you want her to indicate, I love you, she screamed, if she screamed it, you might need to know that. Specificity and vividness. If you can trade vague words for specific vivid words, that's better. And you want to use the lightning, not the lightning bug. So I was looking at what is the right word that gets across what I'm trying to say. A lot of times I'll get manuscripts and they're using a word that's pretty close, but it doesn't really mean the thing they think they're saying. And so, I mean, well, that's fine, but actually that's not even possible. Because this word doesn't mean quite what you think it means. So you just want to make sure all that is true. And then the final polish is typos. Keep their eyes in their heads instead of slithering down people's bodies. ING clauses, which are things like answering the phone, she flung herself onto the bed. Well, you probably either fling yourself on the bed first and then call on the phone, or you do the phone first and then you jump on the bed. But that ING clause usually implies that things happen at the same time. So you got to make sure that the things happen at the same time. And then misplaced modifiers. Here's I think an example of one. I think I have one somewhere. Oh, not that one. Okay, so let's look at the ing words. Running for the bus, he tripped over a crack on the sidewalk. You got to make sure that they can be done simultaneously. Tripping would be something you would do as you're running, so that's fine. But not falling onto the bed, she dialed the phone. That's not very likely you do those at the same time. The misplaced modifiers would be like, Mary moved to a little Irish village with nothing but a suitcase and an extra pair of overshoes. We kind of know what that means, but technically it means that the village has the suitcase and the overshoes. So try, with nothing but a suitcase and an extra pair of overshoes, Mary moved to a little Irish village. So when soon as you get a something like that, Mary moved to a little Irish village, there's a good chance what comes next is going to be interpreted as replying to the village and not to Mary. This one is pretty obvious because the village wouldn't have a suitcase, but if you have a reader who's very literal, they'll stop them and they go, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Oh, wait, it must be Mary. So you don't want to do that. And then the smiling and grinning and smirking words, you don't do that. You either say them, you would not put a comma between the actions. So I've got some of these little things that I'm not going to go into right now because that's pretty granular stuff, but you'll have them here in the handout, and then we can always go into it in more depth if you want to later. The all done, what I like to do before I send it off is one more time, I read it again, but I go backwards and I read it out loud. I read the last paragraph, and then this next to the last paragraph, and then the next to the last paragraph. And the reason I do that is because if you read it forward, you get caught up in the story and you forget to look at errors, and your brain fills in the right thing. It fills in the thing you thought you wrote. But if you go backwards, you're kind of watching it fresh. Some people do it sentence by sentence, but I get kind of lost if I do that. But I find that paragraph by paragraph, reading aloud backwards works. And that's all. And then after that, you can get beta readers. You can get professional editing if you feel like you need it. And then you celebrate. If you have an agent who likes to read your work in progress, you might not need the beta readers, but it depends on your personal situation. So now, I know I kind of rushed through that, but we're getting close. So I'm ready for questions, more questions if you want. And you can also stay in touch with me. Here's my email, jaden@jadenterrell.com. I have this, it's an email list. It's actually a periodic newsletter. And then I send you emails when I have something I think would interest you. I sometimes do prizes and things like that. Facebook author page, and also the Spirit of Ink Facebook group, which is free for any writers and has, I think, a lot of good resources for them. So I'm going to leave this up for just a second, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see you guys. You can see me. Okay. So I see everybody. And the chats. Oh, okay, now I'm going to look at the chat. Janet says she did a backwards reading thing. That's cool. Louise Penny.
That was from me. Yeah. I'm a fan of Louise Penny's.
Me too.
Books. I think they're really, really good. But I tell you, especially in her earlier books, she was always describing Armand Gamache's big hands, and I'm thinking, holy crap, we know they're big.
I know.
Stop it.
I read one from an author I love a lot, and she had something where the tires chirped on the pavement, and the first time I read it, I'm like, oh, that's awesome, I've heard that happen. And then the second time it happened, okay, and then the third and the fourth time it happened, like, I don't think they chirp that often. And so it kind of became from being a really fresh thing to being something that it drew attention to itself at that point. I have casts in a post on my computer. Oh, that's awesome. Dean, this is going to be something about Dean Wesley Smith, because she mentioned Dean Wesley Smith, and I think he has a bunch of free stuff on his website to help writers, as well as his wife, who writes under Christine Catherine Rush. He does have a lot of really good resources there. He's also got a lot of courses that I've heard are excellent. a ton of courses. Some of Dean's stuff I like a lot, and he has a lot of wisdom about it. But one thing I would be careful about is he's very much write it, publish it, let the readers decide if they want it. And that works for Dean Wesley Smith because he had a lot of years where he did a lot of revision and stuff like that. He does the cycling now. I would caution you that if you are at the beginning stages, you get some feedback, be pretty aware that you may later regret it if you put your work out too soon. Even if it doesn't damage your career or your reputation, you will feel bad about it because you knew you didn't do your best stuff. So that idea of I write it and I put it out there, it is good for you if you have a certain process which allows that, where your first draft is pretty much finished and ready to go, or where you cycled as you went through like he does, or if you have a lot of publishing credibility and a lot of publishing experience like he has. But he spent a lot of years truly doing revision and stuff so that he learned that craft before he started this particular process. So I say anybody who talks to you about this is how you do things, including me, look at it with the eye of saying, all right, this is maybe good advice, but will it or will not be appropriate for me? What you say now, something I learned as a reporter writing news stories, change up sentence structure. Oh, yeah. I know several journalists who do that to get that very rhythm. I have a friend.
Used to help us, especially when we were doing investigative pieces, to read it backwards to make sure we didn't have dumb mistakes. Because the last thing you want to do is be writing an expose about somebody and then have some dumbass mistake in your story.
Right. And
like,
then
I can't believe I did that.
You also talk about changing up the sentence structure to keep up the pacing and to keep people reading. Tell us a little more about that and how you do that.
Well, it's just really a matter of, and these were some recommendations from Roy Peter Clark at the Poynter Institute, who's really one of the kind of great journalism writing teachers, would talk about, you want to kind of vary your sentence structure from kind of maybe a longer sentence with some clauses in it as you're describing something, with some very short declarative sentences that really kind of keep the reader kind of moving along. Traditionally in journalism, I think some of my writing turns out that way too, is you want like really kind of tight paragraphs because you're always thinking about how does it look on the page.
Yeah, there's a move toward a lot more white space as well. Jeffrey Deaver talked about that as his publishers are encouraging him to have shorter scenes and shorter paragraphs. And he said he might even go to shorter sentences, although I don't know that that's a good idea, particularly because his writing style is, I think, a little more poetic than that. And I think that if he goes too far in that direction, he will take away from his own writing style. But it's amazing to me the difference it can take. I can take exactly the same piece of writing from a client, and if I break the paragraphs up and break the chapters up, the pacing gets 100 times better. Thank you guys for saying that was helpful. Good.
I just want to say this has been incredibly helpful, and I think a lot of us are feeling a little bit recharged. I think between COVID, our the regular jobs that we do, we've been all just kind of muddling through to get things done, and wow, this has just been invigorating.
I'm really glad, because I think sometimes we get the sense of, oh, I have to write. Really, we get to write. And sometimes you don't want to do it. It's just like kind of exercising. If you don't want to go to exercise, but once you get there, it's really nice. If you can sit down and get to the page. And also, if you're struggling to write, just say, I'm going to play with my book today. And that a lot of times will get the editor brain to chill out and go away, because you can enjoy it. You can put things in your book that are fun that you can take them out later if they don't work. I find a lot of times I have to ramble on, and I end up taking out a big chunk, but this piece over here is gold. But I wouldn't have gotten to the gold if I hadn't let myself follow that trail. I had to write all this crap to get to the gold, and then I can take the crap out and I just have the gold.
Yeah. Hey, Bridget, I see that you posted about the two-part write session in November that National Small. Do you have a link to that you could put up here, or do you have ready access to that? Because maybe if we put it up here, a bunch of us can get registered. I know one of our members said that because so many of us are doing our work on Zoom, that this doesn't quite feel like the fun that it used to be, kind of with fellow writers. But I gotta tell you, this has been a lot of fun today. Bridget just posted a link to the Sisters in Crime event, and it'd be cool if we could all be there.
It would be great. I think it's going to be fun. I do a lot of studying about marketing because it doesn't come naturally to me at all. I will give things away all day long, and yet when it comes time to actually sell somebody something, I have a problem with it. And so I find sometimes you can teach something a little better if you struggled with it yourself, because if it comes naturally, you don't know how you did it. It's just like breathing to you. Well, of course you do this and this and this, but the figuring out, and also you'll see somebody else do something and go, well, they're having good luck with this, I'll try it, and then it doesn't work. Well, it's maybe because it's not a good fit for you. So that's really what this is about. It's like there's all these millions of things you can do. You can't do them all. Don't try to do them all. Just like, let's look at some of these and find the ones that'll be a good fit for you. So that's what it's about. Thank you, Bridget. Fantastic. Does anybody else have anything you'd like to add or ask? No, you don't have to just ask. If you have an insight you'd like to add, that's cool too. We're about done here though, because it's about wrapping up time. Do you want to take the host thing back?
Yeah. How do I do that? It's out of my control, is it?
Maybe I have to do it.
Maybe.
More.
We're learning every day. We'll be techno whizzes by the time the pandemic is over.
I do Zoom a lot, but I don't change the.
Can you tell me, when I first got information, it was Beth Jaden Terrell, and now it looks like it's Jaden Terrell. How are you doing that, and why did it change?
Well, Beth is my name, real name in real life. It's Joan Elizabeth Terrell -Hicks, and I go by Beth. But because of the story I told you about how I was missing my audience, we went with the unisex pen name, and that's what Jaden is. And so, but because so many people know me as Beth, I put Jaden Terrell on all my writing and a lot of press releases and stuff. But I also will say, like, for something like this, I would say Jaden and then put Beth in parentheses Terrell, so that they know it's me. The people who know me as Beth, so that they know that.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, I think this was excellent. I really appreciate your time today.
It was my pleasure. It was a pleasure to be here. You guys are terrific.
So
Gotta be.
did you give, wait, let me see if there's anything. I don't see anything on my end. I'm going to stop recording now though.
Yes. I'm going to say, oh,